support for them and or lack thereof in some cases in this current situation on the ground. So I'll make that over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ilan. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for what has been a very informative series of panels today. I work on Syria every day, but believe me, I learned a lot from the stellar speakers that we have with us today. As Ilan said, my name is Mohammed Ghanem. I'm Director of Government Relations with the Syrian American Council. I'm based out of DC, but I shuttle between DC and the region. SAC is the largest Syrian American grassroots organization. We're run, funded by Syrian Americans. Our mission statement is simple. It's to empower and amplify the voices of Syrian Americans and also empower Syrians seeking to build a free and democratic Syria. On behalf of SAC, I would like to, which co-hosted this day of events, I would like to express and extend our thanks to the Democracy Council, Jim Prince, and also GPD Charitable Trust for making this event a possibility, as well as my compliments, genuine compliments, to all the panelists and guests who've enriched our discussion today. In the summer of 2012, I was in Aleppo city. 40% of Aleppo, the city of Aleppo, there's a city in the province, 40%, and Aleppo, as you know, is the pre-war commercial capital of Syria. 40% of the city had just been captured by the opposition. And it was, at the time, the mainstream opposition was a group called the Free Syrian Army. The regime had just cut off services and was shelling the city to punish its residents for casting off dictatorial rule. It seemed as if the shelling was taking place all around us, and I'll be honest with you, it was quite scary. But amidst the shelling, the battle clashes, the escalating humanitarian crisis, something remarkable was taking root, was taking shape. Doctors, engineers, activists, and other ordinary residents of the city of Aleppo who would not have even dared to speak about governance before the revolution were actually coming together, establishing a new quote-unquote transitional body called the Aleppo Transitional Council. It was transitional because those guys did not want to monopolize power. They were not interested in monopolizing power. Their goal actually was to serve the people. They knew that nature abhorred a vacuum, and there was a vacuum left by the retracting or the contracting state, and they wanted to help fill that vacuum. They saw that vacuum in governance, and they knew that someone had to bring bread to the bakeries, continue to run the hospital, staff the hospital, and collect the trash. I saw piles upon piles of trash when I was in the city, and it was quite an issue. I found their efforts going into Aleppo. Also, to be honest, I was not expecting to see that level of nascent organization. So I found their efforts to be quite impressive for a country in which all forms of civil society have been banned for 50 years. And I know the country like I know the back of my hand because I was born, raised, and I lived for 30 years in Syria. But I was even more impressed in March next year when I was invited to return, but this time as an election monitor for the new Aleppo Provincial Council. The transitional council, the now defunct one, was for the city. Now we're talking about the council for the entire province. When I was walking down the street, I was approached by a group of young activists who, interestingly, requested help with training. Actually, they wanted to be trained as elections monitors. They wanted to monitor the elections of their own city and their own province. And the elections were carried off successfully with election monitors who were Syrians. And Syria's first, in my humble opinion, Syria's first democratic provincial council since the 60s, when the Ba'ath Party took over, took shape in the most, or took power in the most populous province of the country. This episode, especially the young people approaching me, wanting to be trained as elections monitors, for me at the time exemplified the strong spirit of democracy and civic mindedness that pervaded Syria at the time. This was Syria's era of civilian rule, in which local councils spread across the country and filled the vacuum left by the departure of Assad's draconian security forces. Each council, however imperfect they were actually like a small government. They had different bureaus. They had a bureau for education. They had a bureau for health and healthcare, running so many different hospitals. Most of them were underground, for food provisions, for policing. Civil-military relations, especially in 2013, were actually good. I saw that with my own eyes. I saw Free Syrian Army commanders, top commanders actually, blessing those elections, largely not interfering in those elections, but blessing those elections. A real alternative to the regime was emerging, not a person, but actually a whole democratic system, however imperfect it was, or it might have been. Because we get the question most of the time, like, okay, who is going to take over from Assad? As if we're only looking for one person to carry or to stand a whole new government. Syrians were working from the bottom up, ground up, on establishing a system to take over instead of just one person. When I came back to Washington, D.C., we fought with Congress and with the administration for a number of months before we were able to get them to recognize that those councils existed and so we secured recognition, and then minimal funding as well. But the funding, as I'm sure some of you know, the funding came late, not too late, but late, and it was painfully slow, and it was not nearly enough. At times, Congress would appropriate funds to the local councils only for State Department red tape and some officials and bureaucrats to withhold the funds for bureaucratic reasons, and those were not very concerned by the way. I had a friend named Abdallah, who was an attorney. All unions in Syria had to be organized under Ba'ath Party. So he defected, and Abdallah was trying to establish Aleppo's first, of course, alongside others, Aleppo's first free or independent judicial system. That was his goal, to establish the Free Judicial Council that was compatible with democratic norms in Aleppo City. And he spent months trying to secure the necessary funds to establish such a program, to no avail. One day, as I was waiting for a meeting in Hart Senate office building, my friend Amin sent me a desperate message indicating that he had already sold his life's possessions to fund the Free Judicial Council and that he had nothing more to sell. He was actually giving up and clearing the field for extremists. The next day, I learned that he was killed in shelling in Aleppo. As regime atrocities continued, the death toll continued to rise, and as supplies of bread, medicine, and basic daily necessities that we actually just take for granted, we don't think about, grew increasingly scarce. Amidst all of this, extremist forces were indeed able to fill a void. They established robust social services programs that were more extensive, more reliable than what the State Department and other Western countries were willing to provide. They provided some modicum of protection, quote unquote protection, to civilian populations with weapons, ammunition levels, and fighter salaries that exceeded what the West, again, was willing to provide. While Western politicians, and especially American politicians, worried themselves sick thinking of every possible way that arms or food or medicine or money could fall into the wrong hands and therefore should not be provided to pro-democracy Syrians, the extremist forces had no such compunctions. And while Western politicians sought to avoid Syria due to its complexity or perceived complexity at the time, they instead sought to, quote unquote, contain the crisis. Precisely the opposite occurred. When I visited in 2012 and early 2013, Deir ez-Zor, the main Syrian city in the east near the border with Iraq, was under the control of a nascent democratic local council. But extremists gained strength in eastern Syria, and pro-democracy forces were eventually supplanted by ISIS. ISIS routed the Free Syrian Army and besieged Deir ez-Zor in 2014. While Deir ez-Zor was once a thriving center of civil society, however imperfect that might have been, it is a location where civil society activists now will be shot on sight. Of course, we all know ISIS did not content itself with their resort in eastern Syria, but chose to continue on to Mosul, Sinjar, Sinai, Libya, Brussels, Paris. The United States has spent billions of dollars in its anti-ISIS campaign. It conducts regular air raids, and it has deployed special forces on the ground. All actions that would not have been necessary, at least some of them might not have been necessary, had the US worked proactively in 2012 and 2013 to deny ISIS a foothold by supporting civil society and ensuring civilian protection. And if the US today were to flood local councils in Syria with mere millions of dollars, it would still have an outsized impact in combating extremism, and it would not cost a fraction of what the US is paying now for the anti-ISIS coalition. While civil society has been all but wiped out in areas that have fallen to ISIS or Assad, there are still many areas where pro-democracy local councils compete with extremists for popular support based on provision of services. It's an immense humanitarian catastrophe, and provision of services is what gives entities legitimacy, and that's how some of those groups gain legitimacy. Local councils and civilian protection, support for local governance that's conceived at the local level, bottom up, conceived, bottom up, that's key, because most of those discussions in Geneva are about solutions imposed from the top down without even much input from Syrians. So local councils and civilian protection are force multipliers to combat extremism. Assad and Russia know this, and they deliberately attack centers of pro-democracy and civil society so as to squelch all alternatives to Assad's rule. Last month, Assad forces massacred dozens of civilians by bombing a marketplace in Ma'arid al-Nu'man, a town in the province of Idlib, which has seen 2 months of consecutive protests against the local Al-Qaeda affiliate and in favor of democracy, against Jabhat Nusra and in favor of democracy. Regime and Russian forces are now systematically targeting medical facilities in Aleppo city, even those that were built underground to try and shelter from the bombings, or even in caves to shelter from the bombings. If you spend months building a hospital, only to see it bombed by Assad forces, would you build it up again? If you protested for 60 straight days against Al-Qaeda, only to be bombed for it, only to see a massacre against your town by the regime, which claims to be quote-unquote fighting terrorism, would you protest again? Regime attacks on civilians undermine democratic civil society, and they are meant to do so. Assad wants to create a fertile ground for extremism as a way to justify his continued bloody, draconian, and anti-democratic rule. And the best way to undermine him, Assad, and to undermine the extremists is to support the local councils, to support local governments, and to support civil society. Because these groups and these efforts are building the groundwork for a transition away from Assad's rule. Even as pro-regime forces continue to bomb on the ground and Russian diplomats concoct new plans to preserve Assad in power in Geneva. US policy should prioritize local councils, and Congress should take a more aggressive role in this respect, given that the State Department, or the administration in general, has failed to fully answer the bell. Even though the situation in Syria seems hopeless, it can always get much worse, and there is still much good that can be done. So let's get to work together. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. Our next speaker is Samer Arabi. Samer is a senior advisor for Conflict Dynamics International and recently authored a report on local governance and decentralization in northern Syria. He has previously worked as a Syrian program specialist for the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the senior project manager of the Assistance Coordination Unit, and the government relations manager of the Arab American Institute. So Samer, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. You can do it from here, right?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sweet. Can you hear me? Yeah. Great. It is my goal to be the fastest speaker by half. So I'm going to blast through all the things I want to talk about really quickly. I'm just going to quickly give you an overview of the report, and I'm only going to focus on the key implications, I think, for U.S. policy towards Syria. So if there's anything more you want to discuss in more detail, you can ask questions or we can talk about it after. It's going to be 5 minutes, tops. So I've spent the past 10 months or so working on a report with Conflict Dynamics about analyzing the dynamics of local ceasefires that have taken place across Syria. So for the past 2 or 3 years, the Syrian government has negotiated these cessations of hostilities with different opposition groups in specific areas in Syria, like in Zabadani and Wa'ad. They negotiated in East Ghouta, but it never happened. And we also looked at Yalda, a village just outside of Ghanem. And we analyzed kind of the different people involved, how the negotiations process went, why it fell apart, how it held together, the kind of various implications of it. And I just want to share a few of those with you right now very quickly. Firstly, I think it's really important to note in any discussion on local ceasefires, as Marcel mentioned earlier, they're not really ceasefires. Ceasefires implies a certain level of parity between groups, and by and large, these have been a product of an overwhelming imbalance of power in favor of the Syrian government, which has managed to use siege and starvation tactics to force its hand and able to kind of produce an outcome that's very favorable on their side, mainly as an attempt to shut down certain theaters of war and reprioritize resources to the north. Given that, a few things that we notice as commonalities across various ceasefires that I think have significant implications for the national level cessation of hostilities and maintaining it in a certain way include a few core elements that have been undermining this national level process as well that I think we really need to focus on. The first one that I think gets often overlooked is the role of economic incentives for local players on the ground. And as much as we like to think that everyone is driven by these kind of high-minded political motivations, which even if it is the case, you still have to pay your fighters, you have to feed people, you have to function as a sort of proto-governmental body in these areas. And the fact of the matter is that besiegements are highly lucrative economic situations to be in, both for the besieging group and in a lot of circumstances for the armed groups being besieged, because you're maintaining a checkpoint or access points or security checkpoints that enable you to derive a significant amount of rent, both in terms of goods and resources coming in and goods and resources going out. There's a famous checkpoint in the Damascus suburbs called Hajat al-Million, the million checkpoint, because they say $1 million worth of fees gets transacted at that checkpoint per day. And when you're in a situation like that, it's really hard to convince local players on the ground who are actually maintaining those structures of power to substitute those for something else, because frankly, that's how they're bankrolling their operations elsewhere. So we see this as a very distinct commonality across all the various regions. This is particularly true for the reconciliation committees that are operating in each of these areas, which are often handpicked by the Syrian government, or at least have close relations to both, have strong economic linkages both within the areas they're working and in surrounding areas, and use those linkages to frankly profit significantly from the state of warfare. So unless you can undermine those specific economic incentives, it's very difficult to break the status quo in a lot of these areas. For folks in this room, I think it's really important to also acknowledge that U.S. development and stabilization interventions also feed into this economic incentive motivations. A lot of money goes in with very loose accountability through local partners that are properly considered. Projects that, I don't want to name specific projects, but projects that aren't well thought through, projects that aren't really well structured based on local legitimacy on the ground can lead to a very fungible distribution of those resources. That can be problematic. Secondly, the role of international involvement in each of these ceasefires mirrors that of the international involvement in the national cessation of hostilities as well. And what we've seen is basically international involvement can fall into one of three categories. Either pursuing their own particular political or ideological agenda, for example, when Iran tries to push ceasefire negotiations to include population transfers to make sure that certain areas have friendly populations and others get pushed away. Highly problematic. International involvement can also roll with the punches, so to speak, where a ceasefire negotiation will involve population transfers, and the UN will say, okay, well, we'll help you make sure that these population transfers go through. Also problematic. Or international actors can push both sides for a reasonable compromise, which the US has done on occasion, Turkey has done a little bit, and frankly, unpopularly probably in this room, even Russia has done on occasion. It's pushed various players to really come to the table and force them to make some significant compromises. That, as far as you've seen, is the only way these things actually move significantly forward. Lastly, and also very importantly, the role of inclusivity in these agreements is extremely important and often overlooked. I understand this is highly problematic from a U.S. security standpoint, but the fact is that when not all players are included in these negotiations, you're creating an environment that's ripe for spoilers. And when you have spoilers, you have people with an active political and economic incentive to undermine whatever peace negotiations are taking place. We've seen this both in terms of opposition groups who have had to fight other opposition groups, because some have signed on to ceasefires and others have not, and also on the Syrian regime side, where the Syrian regime has to fight pro-government militias that are not included in ceasefire negotiations as well. So it's a strong call for greater inclusivity and a greater consideration of how leaving people out of these things can, frankly, sublimate the violence that we're currently experiencing into something that's different. So what we've seen in a lot of areas where ceasefires have held is that violence has switched from an intergroup form of violence, where it's a very clear line of cleavage where the opposition is fighting the regime, to intragroup violence, where now the opposition, in a position where has to police the area that it's controlling, now has to fight various spoilers and ends up being possibly equally violent, but in a very different way and in a harder way to kind of manage from a macro level process. So those are our main findings from the report that pertain to U.S. policy. There's many others, and I have many more things to say, but I'm over my 5-minute mark, very sadly. So I'll stop it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.